Overview of the R2v3 standard. The standard can be downloaded from Siri's website, sustainableelectronics.org. Once there, you'll select the R2 drop-down button in the top menu bar, then select R2 Standard, which will be listed under the document library. There, you'll also be able to find the REC, or REC, which is the R2 equipment categorization document, which is a supplemental reference document that was created to work in conjunction with the R2 standard. And of course, we'll go over that so you can understand how the rec will interact with the standard. All right, before we get into the R2v3 standard requirements, I want to lay just a little more groundwork here so we have a better overall understanding of the R2v3 standard as well as the other standards we will be required to add. In order to become R2v3 certified, we will additionally need to become certified to an environmental management system and a health and safety management system. If we are performing testing, repairing, or brokering, then we'll also need to become certified to a quality management system. A couple ways to do this. We can choose to become certified to ISO or ISO, which would mean we would add ISO 14001, which is an environmental management system, and ISO 45001, which is a health and safety management system. If we wanted or were required to have a quality management system, we would add ISO 9001. Alternatively, we can add the RIOS standard, which is one management system that combines environmental health and safety and quality management. So let's quickly look at the types of standards that all of these are. R2v3 is a technical standard. What this means is it's going to be a framework limited in scope that focuses only on the technical guidelines and requirements for management of specific processes, equipment, and material. ISO and RIOS are going to be management system standards, meaning their frameworks are going to be a lot more structured, inclusive, and robust in that they're going to give us everything we'll need to manage as an organization to meet the goals of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish within the management system or as an organization. So, a management system is a structured framework that includes all elements or things that will need to be managed in order to meet a high level objective. One system made up of all of our manuals, policies, plans, processes, and procedures that will work together to fulfill the goal or goals of the management system. So let's break down structured framework. Coincidentally, both ISO and RIOS currently use the same framework for their management systems. This framework is known as the PDCA cycle or the plan, do, check, act approach to management. What this means is all three ISO standards and RIOS are going to have management systems that are set up in a way to where we will manage in this order, following this methodology to management, whereby we will first plan before we do anything. Any operation, any activity we carry out as an organization, we will plan to better understand what the risk is, what needs to be mitigated, what needs to be controlled, what resources will need to be in place. Are there any legal obligations that we need to be mindful of? And there will be processes within these management systems that help us do that. The next phase of management, do, which is going to be where we actually are carrying out these operations or activities. And we'll have processes within the system for this to help us control these things as we do them. The next phase will be check, which is where we'll go back and monitor and evaluate how well we're performing. And then we have act, which is where we'll go back and either correct or improve on whatever it was that we did, subsequently taking us back to the first phase plan where we would repeat the cycle. So, this is a risk based approach to management that is centered on continual improvement, which is why both ISO and RIOS have adopted it. Let's now break down the all elements part of the management system. What this means is, in addition to maybe the technical things that we manage as a business, as well as the processes that will be in place throughout this PDCA cycle, there will be supportive secondary processes that will help us fully manage everything that we do, kind of tie everything together, all of the things that commonly go overlooked within management. This will include management of interested parties, which will be the people, organizations, or entities that either affect what we do as a business or are affected by what we do as a business. This will be management of resources, the management of our training programs, the management of communication, knowing what needs to be communicated both internally and externally, and how that communication is managed, as well as the management of documented information. Everything that goes into creating our management system, the policies, the manuals, the plans, the processes, the procedures, the work instructions, the SOPs, how we create those things, how we control those things, and how we revise those things. So, R2v3 technical standard, ISO and RIOS management system standards. To tie this all together, it will be either ISO or RIOS and their management system frameworks that will lend the overall structure or framework for how we will manage the R2v3 technical requirements. The application of management, here we're just trying to get a quick visual for what it kind of looks like applying R2v3 management as well as ISO or RIOS management to us as an organization and what we do. In the first bullet, if we're saying that the blue circle is our organization and the white arrow represents everything we do with used electronic equipment, you can see in the graphic on the right how these standards would apply. Given that R2v3 is going to be more limited in scope and really just kind of manage what we are doing with used electronic equipment, that's really all that's going to be affected. Versus the ISO or RIOS management systems that are really going to be kind of all encompassing, kind of govern everything we do as an organization. You can see we have the structured framework we talked about, the PDCA cycle or the plan, do, check, act approach to management, represented by the outer yellow arrows, as well as the smaller secondary processes we talked about, represented by the inner four yellow arrows. And this is all going to be integrated management, meaning we're going to use this same structure, this same approach to management to manage everything: our environmental performance, our health and safety performance, quality, and all of the R2v3 requirements. All right, let's talk a little R freaking 2. Okay, here we have a condensed version of the R2v3 table of contents. All we're looking to do here is really understand the overall structure and general purpose of each part of the standard. First two parts, introduction and R2 certification, are really going to be just introductory. The introduction part will briefly cover the intent, benefits, and background of the standard and series, as well as introduce the REC or R2 equipment categorization document, which we'll cover here shortly. The R2 certification part will introduce the Code of Practices, which is a companion document created to aid the auditing and certification processes, as well as briefly cover the additional resources provided by Siri. The third part, definitions, will naturally be just that: key terms from the standard defined to help us navigate the standard easier. All right, Now we're getting into our actual requirements or things that we will be audited against. Starting with section 1, the R2 requirements. These are going to be just like they sound. Core requirements. Requirements that will be applicable and required to be met by all R2 companies. There are a total of 10 core requirements, all of which we will briefly discuss in this video. Section 2, unlike Section 1, likely will not all be applicable, but will be based on the specific processes or types of equipment we manage as a company. There are currently 7 different process requirements or appendices listed alphabetically from Appendix A through Appendix G, all of which will cover a different type of specific process for management or a specific type of equipment being managed. When we are audited for certification, we will be audited against all 10 core requirements as well as the applicable process requirements contained within Section 2. Here we have Section 1 expanded just so we can see what all of these core requirements look like together before we go into them one by one. Core 1, scope. Core 2, hierarchy of responsible management strategies. Core 3, EH&S management system. Core 4, legal and other requirements. Core 5, tracking throughput. Core 6, sorting, categorization, and processing. Core 7, data security. Core 8, focus materials. Core 9, facility requirements. And Core 10, transport. And here we have Section 2 expanded, the R2 process requirements. Appendix A, downstream recycling chain. Appendix B, data sanitization. Appendix C, testing and repair. Appendix D, specialty electronics reuse. Appendix E, materials recovery. Appendix F, brokering. And Appendix G, photovoltaic PV modules. For requirement 1, scope. This is going to be a big one. This is going to be where we formally declare as a business or an R2 company who we are, which would include all legal names associated with our management of used electronic equipment, where we operate, all physical addresses, buildings, or suites associated with our management of used electronic equipment. Keeping in mind that R2 certification is facility based, meaning the facility is what's getting certified, not the company. The declaration of what specific types of electronic equipment we are managing and the declaration of what specific processes we are performing. This will tie directly into Section 2 of the standard, the R2 process requirements by design. This is where we will determine what processes or appendices from Section 2 will be added to our certification. Or requirement 2, the hierarchy of responsible management. This requirement is going to be pretty straightforward. This is saying that all R2 companies need to have and adhere to a hierarchy of responsible management policy, whereby all equipment that is managed shall first be directed towards reuse, and when not viable, must then be directed to materials recovery, where raw materials can be extracted and recycled into new products. Disposal is really not going to be an option here, guys, but listed to account for specific types of waste designated by the EPA or other recognized regulatory authority that would require either incineration or disposal through a specialized hazardous waste landfill. An example, this would apply to PCBs or polychlorinated biphenyls that meet a certain criteria and require incineration. Or requirement 3, EH&S management system. This is going to be the requirement we beat to death earlier in the video, the requirement to hold and maintain certification to an EH&S or environmental health and safety management system, which currently will either be ISO or RIOS, with an explicit requirement that all elements of this R2 standard be fully integrated within the EH&S management system. Core 3 will also contain additional requirements such as maintaining sanitary facilities, the prohibiting of food and beverage in areas not maintained free of contaminants, and periodic evaluation of exposure to hazardous substances. This last one will look a little different for everyone, depending on our specific scope and how we process. For some, this may mean IH or an industrial hygiene sampling, while for others, this won't. Core requirement 4, legal and other. Purpose of Core 4 will be to ensure that all R2 companies are maintaining full compliance with all applicable legal and other requirements through the creation and maintenance of a legal compliance plan, which will include applicable regulation for health and safety, environmental, data, and very, very importantly, import and export. This will also include other requirements, which are things like contractual obligations. Within Core 4, there will also be additional requirements for things like child enforced labor, prison labor, and a requirement for a non-discrimination policy. Core requirement 5, tracking throughput. Purpose of this requirement will be to ensure that all R2 companies have full traceability of everything that comes into our facilities, full traceability of on-hand inventory levels and storage durations, and full traceability of everything that leaves our facility. Our specific requirements will be to maintain a summary report listing all inbound shipments, a summary report listing all outbound shipments, as well as the maintenance of detailed commercial records that include dates, types, and quantities of equipment, as well as supplier, customer, or downstream vendor names. This will also include the requirement to not store R2 controlled streams for greater than 1 year. R2 controlled streams we will discuss in the next slide. Boom. Next slide. Core requirement 6, sorting, categorization, and processing. All right, before we get into this one, let's first break down what R2 controlled streams are. R2 controlled streams are types of equipment streams that require a specific type of additional processing. This would include electronic equipment in need of evaluation, data sanitization, testing, repairing, or material recovery, where each one of those potential additional processes would denote a separate type of controlled stream. The essence of core requirement 6 is to help establish the process needed to be able to accurately identify the various types of material streams we manage so that we can effectively control and direct each stream to the appropriate next phase of processing. Whether that phase of processing take place on site or will be performed by a downstream vendor. This is a big one, guys, as different types of controlled streams will warrant different levels of care and protection through management. So this is also where the REC comes into play, or the R2 equipment categorization document. The REC was created to help establish R2 applicability or determine what equipment will need to be controlled under the requirements of the R2 standard, to help establish the data sanitization status of all equipment we manage so that we can effectively manage data versus non-data, as well as to help with the categorization of functioning product so that we are able to accurately communicate the conditions and functionality of the equipment we sell for reuse. Core requirement 7, data security. Purpose of this core requirement will be to help us establish the processes needed to effectively secure and sanitize data. This will include two hard documentation requirements: data sanitization plan, which will outline things like security controls, types of data containing devices we receive, types of data sanitization methods we use, and the identification of downstream vendors who may be performing data sanitization on our behalf. The second documentation requirement will be the creation of a data security policy, which will include things like the assignment of a data protection representative, or DPR, will be tasked with the overall responsibility and authority for the facility's data security and sanitization program. It will include the requirement to report data breaches, requirements for training and confidentiality agreements, as well as identify penalties and personal liability for non-compliance. Core 7 will also require that a data security and sanitization audit be conducted at least annually, which will be conducted to ensure the effectiveness of all data security and sanitization processes. So, just a couple quick notes here. When we talk about data sanitization, we're referencing either one of two things: logical sanitization, which is also referred to as erasure, and physical sanitization, which is more commonly referred to as data destruction. Also, keep in mind that all elements contained within Core 7 are core requirements and fully applicable to even you guys out there who may not perform data sanitization. As any R2 company, um, or as an R2 company, we will still be responsible for ensuring that all data received is managed through an approved data sanitization process. In which case, recalling from the previous slide, if we have equipment that requires additional processing, that would act as a controlled stream and need to be sent to a downstream vendor for additional processing. For requirement 8, focus materials. Let's start by breaking down what focus materials are. These are going to be the specific things that make up electronic equipment that have been determined to warrant greater levels of care through management, either because of the level of risk they pose to us and the environment, or because of the heightened value there is in their recovery. These focus materials are going to be circuit boards, batteries, mercury, CRT glass, polychlorinated biphenyls or PCBs, and solar cells, which are components of PV modules or solar panels. Purpose of this requirement will be to establish the processes needed for how these materials will be managed, both on-site and downstream, whether as individual components or contained within equipment. Through this, we will be required to establish a focus material management plan, which will outline the applied expertise and capabilities needed to manage both on-site and downstream. The planned methods for processing, again, both on-site and downstream, and processing capacities or volumes capable of processing, both on-site and downstream. This will also require us to create a downstream vendor flowchart, which will essentially be a mapping of the R2 controlled streams we manage that are shipped out to downstream vendors for additional processing. Most commonly, this will be end-of-life equipment being shipped out to be processed for material recovery, but also pertain to equipment we ship out in need of data destruction or possibly test and repair. For requirement 9, facility requirements. 4.9 is going to guide how we safely store and process equipment as it relates to our EH&S performance, our legal requirements, and the protection of equipment. It will require that we maintain some type of insurance policy that covers the treatment of work-related injury and illness, as well as the requirement for pollution liability insurance for companies that either process negative value equipment or are certified to Appendix E. 4.9 will also cover the requirement for all companies to have an elaborate closure plan that will act as the instruction for management of facility closure in the event of abandonment or any other unforeseen closure, to include the removal of equipment, supplies, and inventory, applicable sampling and remediation, cleaning, certification of closure, and the closure cost estimate needed to conduct all. This will include the requirement for a financial instrument that has been set aside for closure. For requirement 10, transport. This one is going to be pretty straightforward and just really pertain to the management of equipment that we are transporting. as it relates to legal compliance, things like insurance requirements, DOT regulation, and very importantly, import and export regulation where applicable, as well as EH&S performance or environmental and health and safety, protection of equipment, and the concealment and protection of data while in transport. All right, now we're getting into section 2 of the standard, the R2 process requirements. Just a reminder, these likely will not all be applicable. So as we go through each one, I will start out by calling out general applicability criteria, just to kind of show the companies that these process requirements will typically apply to. Starting with Appendix A, downstream recycling chain. This is going to be applicable to all companies who will need to manage an R2 controlled stream through a downstream vendor for some type of additional processing. This one here is nearly going to be all of us out there. This would speak towards management of end of life equipment needed to be processed for material recovery. Unless we're a smelter or a true end of life processor, we're going to need this appendix to manage how we send that end of life equipment through the recycling chain to ensure that it gets to end of life recycling. This would also apply to maybe companies who do not perform data sanitization, so will be in need of a downstream vendor to manage that process for them. So the purpose of this process is going to be to ensure that all downstream vendors used operate in conformance with the R2 standard. Um, what this means is before we choose or start using a downstream vendor, we will first need to qualify and approve them to ensure that that conformance is in place. So approving a non-R2 downstream vendor is doable, but often challenging and time consuming because we would have to independently verify their conformance with all core requirements as well as all applicable process requirements. So again, it is doable, but will take some extra work. Proving an R2 downstream vendor is a lot more straightforward in that all we will really need to do is confirm the status of their R2 certificate, make sure they're currently certified, as well as verify their scope of certification, just to make sure they are certified to manage the types of electronics we want to send, as well as certified for the additional processes we need them to perform. Lastly, we have mapping out the DSV recycling chain. We touched on this in Core 8 focus materials when we covered the downstream vendor flow chart. So Appendix A just kind of expands upon that a bit. What this means is for transparency, let's say our downstream vendors or recycling chain is made up of non R2 downstream vendors. What this would mean is we would need to map out the entirety of the recycling chain through end of life. So if we send electronics or a controlled stream to a non R2 vendor that we've approved, we would then need to find out where they are going to send equipment. And every subsequent tier beyond until that equipment was processed either through end of life or no longer met the criteria of an R2 controlled stream, which we talked about is defined in the rec. Um, Alternatively, if we are working with R2v3 vendors, we have the option to either map out the entire recycling chain through end of life or can stop at the first R2v3 company as long as we register that company with Siri. It's an easy process on Siri's website. They have a place where we can register downstream vendors, and that would allow us to not have to map out the rest of the recycling chain. Appendix B, data sanitization. This process is going to be applicable to all companies that perform either logical or physical sanitization. Important to note that this will be dependent upon what we actually do. If we only perform logical sanitization, that is all we will become certified to do. We would become certified to Appendix B for logical sanitization only. And of course, if we were only managing physical sanitization or both, our certification would reflect accordingly. Purpose of this process is going to be to enhance data security controls and ensure best practices are being adopted for all data sanitization processes. Just a couple quick notes here from within this process. As it relates to logical sanitization or erasure, just be mindful that we are required to perform logical sanitization through a software. Also be mindful that there is an additional process requirement for data verification, which also needs to be managed through a software. And all the data verification process is where we go back after sanitization has been performed and verify through use of a software that there is in fact no recoverable data on whatever the media type was. As it relates to physical sanitization or destruction, just be mindful that Siri has listed all of the approved methods for physical destruction within R2v3 under Appendix B in Table 1. We cannot adopt our own mechanism or method for destruction. It needs to be an approved method of physical destruction. A couple other things to be mindful of. Um, Full traceability of all data that we manage. We need to be able to trace all data back to the supplier for all data equipment that we manage in some shape or form. Also be mindful that the data sanitization plan we spoke about earlier in core requirement 7 under data security has been expanded upon in Appendix B. In example, in Appendix B, there'll be an additional requirement from the data sanitization plan for us to have a closed circuit security system that has a minimal capacity of 60-day storage retention. Appendix C, test and repair. And this is going to be our first requirement within the standard to additionally add a quality management system. For all companies that certify to Appendix C, they'll also have a quality management system, which currently will either be ISO 9001 or RIOS. This process is going to be applicable to all companies that perform testing or testing and repair. Purpose of this process is going to be to ensure the adoption of best practices within all processing of equipment for reuse. The primary driver of this requirement or process is going to be the R2 reuse plan. A document will be required to create where we will define things like our competency requirements, testing plans, pass-fail criteria for all functions for all equipment we test, product safety plans, as well as product return policy. Um, there are several other things that will need to go into the R2 reuse plan, but as a high-level overview, these are just the things we're going to call out as key components of the reuse plan. Traceability requirements. It's important to note that all equipment being managed for reuse has to be traced by some type of unique identification number, either equipment serial or maybe an asset ID that we issue it. The essence of this will be to be able to trace all equipment for reuse back to a testing record, which we will be additionally required to maintain for all equipment that we test. Repair will be the act of restoring a device or component to a functioning state, after which that equipment would go back through the testing phase or process to confirm functionality. Appendix D, Specialty Electronics Reuse. This process is going to be applicable to all companies that manage as a core part of their business equipment that typically cannot be tested through conventional methods. Equipment such as telecom, medical, and testing equipment, often referred to as specialty electronics. The purpose of this process will be to allow for the legitimate reuse of equipment that often requires sophisticated test equipment and simulations to test functionality. In order to manage this type of equipment for reuse, there are several conditions that must be met, um, to include confirmation that the equipment has been removed from a working environment, free of any defects, corrosion, or things like that, no missing parts or components, and verification that the serial numbers and part numbers are correct. Um, there are also specific requirements here in place within Appendix D for product return, that the equipment shall be accepted back at no cost to the customer at any time, um, as well as specific labeling requirements for all equipment being sold under the specialty electronic reuse classification. Another big requirement here in Appendix D is that all companies that certify to Appendix D to manage specialty electronic reuse also have to become certified to Appendix C. The reason for that is these Appendix D companies will still be required to test all the equipment that is capable of being tested. This isn't like um, the free pass to sell a bunch of untested electronics. It would only apply to a very specific type of electronic equipment, which is why the requirement for Appendix C is in place, because they will have to test everything else that is capable of being tested. And with Appendix C, of course, comes that additional requirement for the quality management system. Appendix E, materials recovery. This process is going to apply to all companies who process equipment for end-of-life recovery, to include manual disassembly, shredding, mechanical separation, and chemical processing. The purpose of this process is to establish the best practices for the safe and responsible management of focus materials in end-of-life processing. This is going to be another pretty robust section, but some key highlights here are going to be a comprehensive hazard identification assessment, an industrial hygiene program um, geared to the level of risk, as well as the requirement to maintain pollution liability insurance. Appendix F, brokering. This is the second requirement within the standard for a quality management system. All companies who are certified to Appendix F shall additionally certify to a quality management system. This process is going to be applicable to all companies who manage the movement of end-of-life equipment from a supplier directly to a downstream vendor. The purpose of this process is going to be to ensure R2 conformity for all equipment managed through brokery. A couple key elements of this process: identify and demonstrate conformance to all legal requirements, very especially import and export, manage the movement of all R2 controlled streams through the DSV flowchart using the REC, and assume responsibility for data while in transport, to be managed under Core 10 transport. And finally, Appendix G, photovoltaic PV modules. This is going to be applicable to all companies that manage solar panels. Purpose of this process will be to ensure the safe and responsible management of photovoltaic PV modules. Key points here from this process will be the requirement for periodic exposure sampling, a documented process for preventing energization during transport, storage, and processing, as well as the requirement for all solar panels that are being processed for reuse to be done so in conformance with Appendix C. I know this was a longer one, guys, so I do apologize, but it was truly intended just to be helpful. So hopefully you found value in walking through the standard with me. As a reminder, this was just an overview, not a complete look at every single requirement contained within the standard. more of a skeletal view to hopefully strengthen your ability to now go through the standard on your own and be better equipped to understand what R2 is requiring of us. If there are any questions at all with the content I've covered, or any questions you come across after going through the standard on your own, just reach out. I will respond as quick as I possibly can. You can reach me at Gabriel at 360compliant.com. Thank you all very, very much for watching.